October 1944, off the coast of Samar, Philippines, early morning light. The Philippine Sea lay under a sheet of pale silver haze, its surface broken only by long, low swells rolling up from the south. The air carried the smell of distant rain and warm diesel fumes drifting across Taffy 3's thin defensive screen. To the men aboard the USS Samuel B. Roberts DE 413, the day felt like any other in the long grind of the Leyte landings, humid, bright, deceptively quiet. The ship's hull vibrated with the steady pulse of its turbo-electric drive, a soft mechanical rhythm that matched the calm tempo of the escort carrier formation far to the east. Yet even in this stillness, there was a subtle tension threaded through the horizon. The morning sky had a faded quality, washed-out blues and streaks of white that seemed to absorb sound rather than carry it. The seabirds circling low over the water behaved strangely, gliding in uneasy arcs, as though disturbed by something far beyond human senses. Beneath that muted calm, the crewmen felt the weight of the Pacific pressing in, a vast, unpredictable frontier that had swallowed fleets whole and churned them into memory. The Samuel B. Roberts moved confidently at her station, cutting a neat wake through the rolling sea. At just 306 feet long, she looked almost fragile against the immensity around her. Thin hull plates, 5-inch guns barely large enough to be noticed at a distance, deck fittings exposed to the weather. She was built for convoy escort, sub-hunting, and keeping close to carriers, not for slugging it out with capital ships. The men understood this truth, lived with it, and joked about it on better days. Today, however, the ship carried an unusual undercurrent of readiness, as if the metal itself sensed that the ocean ahead was holding its breath. To the northwest lay the dark mass of Samar, a jagged silhouette rising from the sea, its ridges shrouded in mist. Toward that direction, the horizon deepened into a bluish-gray band, a color sailors recognized instinctively as unfriendly. Low clouds drifted near the waterline, moving in slow, deliberate formations as if shadowing something hidden beneath them. The tropical air had the density of an approaching storm, heavy enough to make clothing cling to the skin and breath slow in the chest. Over the horizon beyond the curvature of the world, an enormous force was moving through the morning haze. The Japanese center force, led by the Yamato, was pushing southeast with thunderous determination. Its guns, 18.1-inch main batteries capable of hurling armor-piercing shells the weight of small cars, were already elevated, trimmed for battle. The sea around them trembled with each coordinated turn of the fleet. It was a formation built for decisive victory. Battleships, heavy cruisers, light cruisers and destroyers advancing at full battle speed. But no one aboard Taffy 3's small escort ships knew. The American carriers to the east continued launching anti-submarine patrol flights. The destroyers Johnston and Hull cut their steady patrol lines. The carriers Fanshawe Bay, White Plains, Kalinin Bay, Kitcoon Bay, and others maintained their slow transit, their decks busy with aircraft maintenance crews preparing for another routine day of close air support runs. There was no hint yet that the entire Japanese battle doctrine, battered but not broken, was about to collide with one of the smallest, most lightly armed American task groups afloat. On the Samuel B. Roberts, the crew performed their usual morning checks. Ammunition handlers confirmed turret readiness. Engineering monitored the turbine load. Lookouts scanned the horizon in measured sweeps. Nothing appeared unusual, no smoke trails, no periscope wakes, no aircraft silhouettes cutting through the haze. The Pacific seemed vast and empty. But the ship's captain had already sensed an unease in the radio traffic from the night before. Reports had been scattered, irregular. Enemy movements in the northern straits felt inconsistent with typical Japanese tactics. Somewhere beyond the radar horizon, something large was moving, but without confirmation, it remained only a fragment of suspicion. The sea held its secrets well. By now the light had sharpened into a pale gold glow, casting long reflections across the water. The swells grew thicker, heavier, as if reacting to distant displacement. The Roberts rose and fell along the shifting contours of the ocean, her bow slicing upward cleanly before dropping again with a hollow thud. Metal fittings rattled softly, creating a muted percussion that blended with the rhythmic churn of the propellers. It was the sound of a small ship moving confidently, unaware of the scale of the storm forming just beyond the horizon. Then, subtle at first, the environment changed. A faint tremor in the air. A pressure shift. The kind of atmospheric distortion that experienced naval officers recognized instinctively, heavy guns firing somewhere far away. The Pacific transmitted such disturbances across astonishing distances, surface ripples of unseen violence. The crewmen didn't consciously notice it yet, but their bodies reacted, a tension in the shoulders, a faster heartbeat, a sense that the ocean around them had taken on a new, sharper edge. Far to the northwest, the Japanese force began to unmask its formation. Lookouts aboard their battleships spotted faint specks on the horizon, white wakes, slow-moving silhouettes, unmistakably escort carriers. The center force adjusted course. The enormous engines of Yamato and her companions increased output, kicking up long streaks of foam behind their hulls. The battle line was forming. But aboard the Samuel B. Roberts, the sea was still calm. The men were still unaware that within minutes, the tranquility around them would shatter. The most powerful battleship ever constructed was advancing toward them, its guns ready, its bridges filled with officers studying range charts and plotting firing solutions. The destroyer escort continued her steady patrol, her crew working through routine tasks, unknowing that fate was about to thrust them into one of the greatest mismatches in naval history. The Pacific morning held its breath, and the sky, once soft and pale, began to darken ever so slightly at the edges, an omen that the day was about to fracture into fire and steel. The road that led the USS Samuel B. Roberts, D-413, to this fragile corner of the Pacific was shaped by months of shifting strategy, immense logistical commitments, and the escalating desperation of the Imperial Japanese Navy. In the broader sweep of the Leyte campaign, Taffy 3 was never meant to be the point of impact for a battleship armada. Its escort carriers were built for air support, not fleet defense. Its screening ships were constructed for anti-submarine operations, not stand-up fights against cruisers. Yet the collision course had been set long before dawn that morning, woven through choices made in distant command rooms and carried forward by fleets hundreds of miles apart. Earlier in the year, the American advance across the Central Pacific had carved open a path toward the Philippines. From the Marianas to the Palaus, each step tightened the noose around Japan's shrinking capacity to sustain the war. The destruction of Japanese aviation strength during the Battle of the Philippine Sea had crippled their ability to contest American carrier groups head-on. Still, their surface fleet remained formidable, battleships with massive armor belts, heavy cruisers with long-range gunnery, and a command structure willing to gamble everything on a decisive blow. Operation Shogo, the Japanese counteroffensive plan, was built on that desperation. It aimed to throw multiple naval forces into the central Philippines simultaneously, surrounding the American invasion fleet at Leyte Gulf. The center force, under Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita, was the most powerful of these. It included the giants of the Japanese surface navy, Yamato, Musashi sunk earlier in the Sabine Sea, and a line of cruisers and destroyers capable of unleashing enormous firepower. Their mission was to break through the San Bernardino Strait, sweep south along the Samar coast, and annihilate the lightly defended escort carriers supporting the American landings. For the Americans, the confidence that Kurita's force had been turned back the previous day shaped their entire deployment. Reports of massive damage inflicted by carrier aircraft suggested the center force was finished. Signals intelligence added to the belief that Japanese command cohesion had fragmented. As a result, the fast carrier groups withdrew northward in pursuit of the decoy northern force, a cluster of Japanese carriers with almost no aircraft, designed to lure the Americans away. The trap worked. By the time dawn broke off Samar, Taffy 3 found itself alone. The Samuel B. Roberts, commissioned only months earlier, had been forged for escort duty, not pitched battle. Built at the Brown Shipbuilding Company in Houston, her construction embodied the American wartime industrial surge, a streamlined hull, light armor, compact machinery, and a weapons suite optimized for submarine threats. Her main battery, two 5-inch .38 caliber guns, was accurate, dependable and versatile, but not designed to challenge armor plate dozens of times thicker than her shells could penetrate. Her torpedo tubes were a last resort weapon, intended for close-range defense. Everything about her design emphasized agility and endurance, not brute strength. Still, she carried a crew that had trained relentlessly. The men aboard had developed an intuitive sense of the ship's rhythms, the way her deck flexed under sudden acceleration, the rumble of her turbines when pushed to maximum output, the distinctive vibration of her hull when maneuvering sharply. They understood her limits intimately, how long the guns could sustain rapid fire before overheating, how much strain the drive shafts could withstand, how quickly the ship could turn inside a tight arc without risking structural damage. It was a finely tuned understanding, honed through months at sea. The broader strategic picture placed these men at the outer edge of a vast logistical network. The entire Leyte operation depended on continuous air support from escort carriers, small, slow, and vulnerable platforms that relied entirely on their escorts for survival. With the main American fleet racing north, Taffy 3's carriers were essentially the only aviation support available to the soldiers fighting inland. Their survival was not just a matter of naval pride, it was fundamental to the entire ground campaign unfolding on Leyte Island. Meanwhile, deep within the San Bernardino Strait, the Japanese center force had reorganized itself overnight. The loss of Musashi the previous afternoon had reduced their heavy armor, but Yamato alone remained more powerful than any combination of ships Taffy 3 could muster. The heavy cruisers Chōkai, Haguro, Tone, Chikuma, Suzuya, and others carried long-range guns capable of engaging targets beyond the horizon. Their commanders believed they were closing in on a cluster of major American carriers, the type that had devastated Japanese naval aviation. They advanced in battle formation, preparing to strike what they assumed was a significant carrier group. The geography of the area played a brutal role in what was about to unfold. Samar's eastern coastline forms a natural funnel, with long, shallow continental shelves stretching eastward and deep ocean trenches to the north and east. The waters between Taffy 3 and the approaching Japanese fleet offered no concealment, no islands to hide behind, no reefs to break up formations, no protective terrain. The morning haze was the only barrier, and even that would soon dissolve under the heat of rising sunlight. Atmospheric conditions added another layer of treachery. The thin haze that coated the horizon distorted distance, making it difficult for observers to distinguish between small aircraft carriers and larger fleet carriers until well within gun range. Radar performance, while effective for air search, struggled against the surface clutter and uneven weather patterns near the coast. This imperfect picture lulled the American ships into a sense of relative safety, unaware of the steel tide bearing down upon them. Inside the Japanese formation, gunnery officers reviewed firing tables, adjusting for wind, visibility, and the expected maneuvers of American forces. Yamato's main batteries could reach more than 20 miles, far beyond the capabilities of anything Taffy 3 carried. Heavy cruisers readied armor-piercing shells. Destroyers prepared their torpedo tubes. It was a fleet built for one purpose: to smash through resistance quickly and overwhelmingly. Yet fate had aligned the smallest of American escorts directly in their path. The Samuel B. Roberts, with her thin armor and lightweight frame, was steaming calmly at the far end of her carrier group's protective arc, unaware that within minutes, she and a handful of sister ships would face a force that on paper should have annihilated them without effort. The world that led to this moment was a web of miscalculations, strategic gambits, and the chaotic momentum of war. In that convergence, a destroyer escort barely larger than a coastal steamer would soon choose a course that defied every doctrine of naval warfare. The first hint of disaster arrived not as a sound, but as a shape. A faint, unnatural line on the northwestern horizon, long, sharp, and rising higher than any formation Taffy 3 expected to see. The lookouts aboard the escort carriers hesitated for a moment, unsure whether the silhouette was a trick of haze or the edge of a distant squall. But then the shape multiplied. One dark line became several turret caps, masts, superstructures layered in ominous tiers. The morning light caught the metal surfaces, just long enough to reveal unmistakable geometry, battleship, pagoda towers, heavy cruiser profiles, the unmistakable enormity of a Japanese main battle line on the USS Samuel B. Roberts. The first report transmitted across the task group triggered an immediate shift in posture. The air around the ship seemed to tighten as if the Pacific itself recoiled from what was emerging through the haze. Seconds later, another confirmation, multiple large ships closing fast, bearing the characteristic stacked silhouettes of the center force. The impossible was unfolding. The Japanese battle fleet had broken through the San Bernardino Strait and was advancing directly upon Taffy 3's position. The sea, moments before calm and reflective, seemed to tilt toward aggression. A slight wind kicked up across the decks, carrying the sharper edge of incoming pressure waves. The Roberts altered course to bring her guns to bear, her wake carving a crisp white arc through the gray-blue surface. The ship's hull vibrated more intensely as steam turbines began to push toward combat speeds. Every man aboard felt the unmistakable acceleration of a vessel shifting from routine operations into survival posture. Then came the sound, deep, rolling, unmistakably distant but heavy enough to penetrate the bones. The first, Japanese salvos. Yamato's main batteries opened fire. The air quivered, the horizon flashed. A fraction of a heartbeat later, a low, concussive rumble reached the American formation, carrying across miles of open water. Each salvo produced a faint shimmer along the surface, a distortion caused by atmospheric shock waves flattening the ocean's reflection for a brief moment. The Roberts lookouts watched the fall of shot in stunned silence as towering plumes of water erupted near the escort carriers. Each geyser rose hundreds of feet, casting mist wide across the sea, turning sunlight into fractured prisms. The enemy had found their range. What had looked like distant silhouettes moments earlier had now become an active closing threat, heavy cruisers accelerating, battleships maintaining formation, destroyers fanning outward like predators winding a noose. Taffy 3 began evasive maneuvers. The escort carriers swung into the wind to launch their remaining aircraft, FM-2 Wildcats and TBM Avengers, many loaded with only light machine gun ammunition or depth charges. Still, anything that could fly was sent skyward. The sky above the Roberts filled with the rising hum of aviation engines as pilots took off into the uncertain glare of the morning sun, their silhouettes briefly framed against the towering columns of water thrown up by enemy fire. The Roberts remained close to her assigned carrier, but the tactical reality was shifting by the second. More splashes erupted, closer this time, the enemy adjusting their aim with frightening speed. The air grew thicker with the tang of cordite drifting from distant gun blasts. Vibrations from the shock waves became sharper, rattling metal fittings along the hull. The Japanese cruisers had now advanced far enough that their secondary batteries and smaller caliber guns came into play. The sea, around the American formation, erupted in rapidly growing clusters of splashes. The escort carrier's thin armor offered no protection against hits of that magnitude. They needed time, minutes that felt impossibly short, to escape the immediate envelope of heavy gunfire. It was in this early stage of chaos that the Samuel B. Roberts faced her first tactical crossroad. Her mission had been clear until now: screen the carriers from submarine threats and maintain an anti-air posture. But the scale of the approaching force, battleships and cruisers capable of outranging every gun in Taffy 3, rendered her standard doctrine obsolete. The Roberts could not simply maintain escort position. She would have to engage, and decisively. The ship's 5-inch guns locked into their initial firing bearings. Ammunition handlers moved with controlled urgency, feeding shells into the hoists. Fire control systems began calculating trajectories far beyond typical engagement distances. The ship's torpedo tubes, seldom used in daily operations, were checked and readied. The moment demanded every tool the ship carried, even if none of them were designed for situations like this. Then, without warning, a shell landed close enough off the Roberts' starboard side to drench the deck in a sheet of spray. The detonation thundered across the hull, jolting equipment, shaking railings, and sending a vibration through the decking that lingered for several seconds. The men understood immediately. Enemy spotters had marked their position. The tropical haze that once concealed the horizon was now broken by the geometry of incoming fire. High-velocity shells carved visible arcs through the sky, their trajectories leaving faint trails of heat-distorted air. Some erupted hundreds of yards off target. Others fell terrifyingly close. The rhythm of impacts created a pattern, a poorly synchronized drumbeat that tightened its tempo with every salvo. To the north, closer to the advancing cruisers, the destroyers Johnston and Hull maneuvered aggressively, charging into the chaos to draw fire and disrupt enemy targeting. Their movements carved deep scars into the ocean surface. Yet the Japanese formation adjusted seamlessly, shifting batteries to engage multiple targets simultaneously. The Roberts commanding officers recognized the truth with chilling clarity. The escort carriers could not withstand sustained bombardment. Every minute lost increased the risk of catastrophic hits. The destroyers alone could not break the enemy's momentum. The odds were impossible. The threat was overwhelming, but the tactical necessity was absolute. The only way to buy time, any time, was to attack. The Samuel B. Roberts, built for submarine screens and convoy protection, would have to confront battleships and heavy cruisers head-on. Her guns, her torpedoes, and her accelerating hull were now the only tools between Taffy 3 and annihilation. With the sea erupting around her and the air vibrating with the relentless cadence of enemy salvos, the ship angled toward the advancing Japanese force. The first contact had become a battle. The battle was becoming a pursuit, and the pursuit was about to become a charge. The charge of the Samuel B. Roberts began not with a heroic boom of guns, but with an unmistakable metallic shudder, an involuntary protest from a hull that understood physics far better than the men ordering it forward. The deck plates flexed, the railings vibrated, and the turboelectric drive strained with a pitch that suggested the ship was politely reminding its crew that it had been designed for 23 knots, not the 28 it was now being asked to produce. The Roberts, in her own way, seemed to communicate that this was an ambitious request, but she would attempt it anyway. Spray blasted across the bow as the ship tore through the rising swells. The momentum generated an entirely new rhythm beneath the deck, a harsh, urgent vibration that echoed through bulkheads like the sound of a thin metal drum being struck too hard. The air filled with a faint scent of hot lubricants and overworked machinery, the byproducts of a small hull being pushed far beyond expectations. Every indicator needle in the engine room crept into ranges normally associated with training lectures about what not to do, but there was no turning back. Ahead lay a column of Japanese cruisers adjusting course to meet the unexpected American countercharge. The Roberts angled directly toward the nearest heavy cruiser, Chōkai, a ship whose silhouette dwarfed the destroyer escorts so completely that the comparison felt almost abstract. The Japanese vessel's armor belt was thicker than the Roberts' hull plating. Its main guns had the range, weight, and punch to obliterate small ships with single hits. By all conventional reasoning, the Roberts was performing a maneuver best described as improbable, if not mathematically irresponsible. Still, she closed the distance. Her forward 5-inch gun opened fire, sending its first rounds downrange with crisp, controlled precision. Each shell traced a bright arc across the sky before plunging toward the enemy cruiser. The rate of fire increased rapidly as loaders worked at a pace that would later be described as reckless efficiency. Within minutes, the gun crew exceeded the weapon's designed sustainable firing schedule. The barrel's exterior warmed, then glowed faintly, a visible reminder that certain engineering limits existed for good reasons. Yet the rounds continued to fly. The Roberts had found her rhythm, rapid, insistent, almost defiant. The Japanese formation staggered momentarily under the intensity of the unexpected resistance. Splashes erupted near the bow of Chōkai as Roberts' shells landed close enough to force minor course corrections. The range was still extreme, the odds still absurd, but the American ship's accuracy carried a sharpness that Japanese spotters had not anticipated. A destroyer escort, barely half the displacement of a cruiser, was legitimately threatening their firing stability. Incoming fire intensified. High-velocity shells screamed overhead, their trajectories leaving faint ripples of distorted air in their wake. Some detonated close enough to shake the ship from bow to stern, A near miss off the starboard side blasted a column of water high enough to cast shadows across the deck. The Roberts bucked sharply, her crew bracing against the impact as the shockwave hammered through the hull. Inside the ship, compartments rattled in disturbing harmony. A set of unsecured tools clattered across a workbench in engineering, establishing an improvised percussion section that accompanied the sudden acceleration. One petty officer, noting the cacophony, later described the moment with a dry understatement. Sounded like the ship was rearranging itself without permission. It was humor by necessity, observational, restrained, the kind that grew naturally in men confronting overwhelming odds. As the Roberts closed the distance, the decision was made to unleash her torpedoes. It was a maneuver that exploited the ship's one offensive punch capable of meaningfully damaging a heavy cruiser. The tubes were trained outboard, firing calculations were made rapidly, compensating for speed, bearing and the unpredictable movements of a cruiser already adjusting under fire. Then the torpedoes launched, slender, silver streaks diving cleanly into the churning sea, heading straight toward the enemy line. The Roberts immediately swung hard to port, trying to present the smallest target profile possible. The maneuver produced a sudden deep lean to starboard that made loose items throughout the ship behave with an enthusiasm not accounted for in naval stability manuals. A bucket rolled the full length of a passageway, rattling like a caged animal. A set of binoculars slid across the bridge deck with determined speed before being intercepted by a very alarmed officer's boot. It was chaos, but controlled chaos, ordered by necessity, navigated with grit. Then, astonishingly, the Roberts scored hits. Her 5-inch shells found vulnerable sections of Chōkai's upper works, damaging fire control systems and forcing more pronounced evasive movement. Another cruiser, Chikuma, found its stern hammered by concentrated fire from the American screening ships. The combined disruption affected the Japanese firing rhythm. The towering pillars of water that had moments earlier risen with terrifying accuracy now began landing in looser patterns. The Roberts had bought critical seconds, but the enemy was not deterred for long. The heavy cruiser's guns regained their coordination, and new salvos erupted from the horizon. One shell passed close enough above the Roberts' deck to create a pressure wave that momentarily stole the breath from several crewmen. Another detonated behind the ship, showering the stern with shrapnel that clattered against metal surfaces like handfuls of thrown gravel. Still, the Roberts pressed forward. Her engine strained with a voice that bordered on complaint, a relentless mechanical groan that seemed to question every decision being made topside. The ship's maximum design speed had long been surpassed. The hull flexed, groaned, and soldered on. If the ship had possessed a personality, observers might have described it as exasperated but loyal, doing everything asked of it, even while clearly noting that none of this resembled ideal operating conditions. The crisis point approached rapidly. The Roberts was now dangerously close to the enemy cruisers, well within range of every weapon they carried. The sea around her frothed with the fall of shells, the sky above rippled with the distortion of blast pressure, the ship's decks vibrated with the force of her own guns. And yet the destroyer escort, this thin, lightly armored vessel, held her course without hesitation. The breaking point had arrived, but it was not the Roberts that broke. It was the symmetry of the battle itself, shattered by a small ship refusing to accept its place in the hierarchy of naval warfare. When the final Japanese salvos tore into the Samuel B. Roberts, the ship had already exceeded every expectation of her design, her doctrine, and her destiny. The damage that crippled her came not from failure, but from endurance. The simple, impossible reality that a vessel built to escort convoys had stood within gun range of heavy cruisers and battleships for longer than any naval architect would have willingly endorsed. Steel torn open, compartments flooding, electrical systems stuttering under the strain, the Roberts began to lose the battle with buoyancy. The order to abandon ship followed a grim rhythm. Men moved through smoke-filled passageways, lit only by the thin rays of sunlight piercing cracks in the buckled hull. The ship listed sharply, decks angling toward the sea as water poured in. Equipment drifted weightlessly in flooded compartments, wrenches, charts, a metal mug that had survived the entire battle until now, stubbornly refusing to sink as if participating in one last act of resistance. Those who reached the rails paused briefly, absorbing the scene around them. The Pacific had shifted again from battlefield to indifferent expanse. Shell splashes had diminished as Japanese gunnery attention fractured across multiple targets. Smoke from burning ships drifted into long horizontal bands across the water. The escort carriers, still fleeing eastward, moved with a kind of strained determination, their silhouettes flickering in the haze like exhausted animals outrunning a predator. The Roberts heeled further. Water surged over the deck. The remaining crew slid or climbed toward the starboard side, abandoning the vessel they had pushed beyond every imaginable limit. As they entered the sea, the sudden cold shocked the senses. The surface, previously churned by shellfire and rapid movement, now felt heavy and slow, as if reluctant to accept the men who had fought so fiercely to remain upon it. Minutes later, the ship rolled completely. The underside of her hull flashed briefly in the morning light before slipping beneath the surface. The Roberts descended quietly, leaving only ripples, small vanishing rings that barely hinted at the force of the struggle that had taken place there. A few crewmen, watching the last air bubbles rise, remarked later that the sinking felt almost polite, as if the ship had chosen to bow out with dignity rather than spectacle. The battle raged on around them, but the Japanese momentum had already fractured. Hours earlier, they had advanced as a coherent, overwhelming force. Now their formation was a patchwork of damaged cruisers, smoke-plumed destroyers, and officers re-evaluating every assumption they had made about the strength of their opponents. Reports flowing between Japanese ships reflected genuine confusion. Multiple accounts described the ferocity of American destroyers and destroyer escorts that charged with reckless courage, an observation delivered with a mixture of respect and disbelief. One heavy cruiser, pummeled earlier by concentrated fire from the American screen, lost steering and drifted in a slow, uncontrolled arc. Others suffered persistent attacks from aircraft launched by Taffy 3, planes that, lacking proper ordnance, resorted to strafing runs, dry passes, and even simulated attack dives to draw attention. Some pilots reported circling Japanese ships with no ammunition whatsoever, relying solely on the intimidation of their approach. Whether these pilots viewed this tactic as a legitimate strategy or a practical expression of stubbornness remains open to interpretation. By late morning, the Japanese center force withdrew northward. Whether their decision stemmed from confusion, overestimation of American carrier strength, or simple loss of momentum, historians still debate, but the effect was unquestionable. Taffy 3 survived. The invasion force at Leyte remained intact. The Japanese Navy had lost its final opportunity to reverse the tide of the Pacific War. For the survivors of the Roberts, the long hours in the water tested endurance in a way the battle had not. Sun exposure pressed down with merciless heat. Wounds stung with salt water. Swells lifted and dropped them in slow, disorienting cycles. Some men clung to debris. Others floated with life jackets that creaked with each rise and fall. A few exchanged understated remarks about the ship's performance, observations that in other circumstances might have passed for quiet humor. One sailor later noted that after witnessing the Roberts go toe-to-toe with cruisers, he had begun to suspect she might simply reappear on the horizon, irritated but operational. Rescue came hours later, as American ships and aircraft swept the area. Crews hauled exhausted men aboard, recording their names, treating injuries, offering water. Many of the Roberts crew were surprised to learn how significant their stand had been, how their charge had altered the course of the battle. The scale of their achievement, measured against the enormity of the enemy fleet they confronted, remained unreal even as the facts solidified. The after-action reports painted a clear picture. The Samuel B. Roberts had closed to within point-blank range of enemy heavy cruisers, fired hundreds of shells at rates surpassing weapon specifications, launched torpedoes that forced evasive maneuvers, and drawn enemy fire away from the vulnerable escort carriers long enough for them to escape. Her actions had directly influenced the Japanese withdrawal. The destroyer escort that was never designed for surface combat had become a decisive factor in one of the most improbable naval victories of the war. In the years that followed, naval officers studied the battle with a blend of admiration and disbelief. The Roberts' performance became a benchmark for courage under impossible conditions, a case study in tactical improvisation, crew discipline, and unyielding resolve. Some training manuals would later reference the engagement with a degree of academic understatement, noting that the ship exceeded design expectations. Those familiar with the battle often regarded this phrase as a masterpiece of military understatement, bordering on dry comedy. Today, the legacy of the Samuel B. Roberts endures as one of the defining legends of American naval history, not because she survived. She did not. Not because she was the strongest, or the fastest, or the most heavily armed. She was none of these things. Her legacy endures because she demonstrated that the strength of a ship lies not in its armor, or its guns, but in the resolve of the men who serve aboard her. The Pacific was filled with larger vessels, thicker plates, heavier barrels, but none fought with more improbable audacity. In the great sweep of naval warfare, the Roberts stands as a reminder that courage is not the byproduct of superiority. It is what emerges when all superiority has been stripped away, and somewhere beneath the waters east of Samar, the hull of a small escort ship rests quietly, bearing witness to the morning she charged a battleship and fought far beyond the limits of steel.